From silencing atrocities on their own people to refusing to teach that the Civil War was about slavery, these disturbing moments are rarely taught in American schools. Up first, the Punitive Expedition. Mexico was in the midst of its 1910 to 1920 revolution when the American government recognized Pancho Villa's former ally and now rival, Carranza, as the head of the government of Mexico, and then helped move troops to defeat Villa in battle. Understandably, Villa wasn't exactly happy, so to retaliate, he crossed the border and raided the town of Columbus, New Mexico. In response for this, the American government launched the Punitive Expedition to punish Villa and capture him. They did succeed in destroying Villa's main force in battle, but couldn't catch him, and then ended up running around Mexico for a month trying to find the guy while getting violently ill, before Carranza, the one America was supporting, decided he didn't actually like having 10,000 American soldiers just running around his country and forced them out. Next are Scalp Bounties. We often think of scalping as being a native or indigenous action, and to be fair, different Native American groups during colonialism did scalp. But what often isn't taught is that from the 1650s to late 1800s, the American government issued over 60 different native bounties. That's right, a cash prize for hunting down native people and ending them, the proof being their scalps. These weren't prizes for just adult men either, but anyone. This was harm and cleansing sanctioned by the state, and was actually so incredibly popular it bankrupted multiple states. That's how rabid settlers were to wipe out the native population. Each bounty was levied against a specific group or tribe that was the target of harm at the time, but combined together over several centuries, it made up one of the most outright brutal parts of American colonialism. Next is Fort Sumter. One of the greatest tragedies of the American education system is that it is completely unstandardized in many cases, and in some cases doesn't need to adhere to actual historical fact at all. For instance, many schools in the southern United States are taught a completely false history of the Civil War, known as the Lost Cause myth. The Lost Cause says that these fine, upstanding men of the South were oppressed by the tyrannical North, and that they only fought to preserve their beautiful way of life. Just because slaves were integral to that doesn't mean it was about slavery, right? Never mind that it was the Confederacy that refused any compromises. Never mind that their beautiful way of life was built on one of the most brutal and encompassing slave states in history. Two other facts prove the Lost Cause wrong. First, every single Confederate leader made it very clear slavery and racial supremacy were the reasons for their rebellion. Second, they literally attacked first by firing on Fort Sumter. Next is the Tuskegee Study. This one is slightly better known given it is one of the most infamous clinical studies of all time. The Tuskegee Study ran for 40 years, its purpose being to examine the consequences of untreated syphilis. So surely this was rigorously combed over by an ethics committee, right? No, of course not. This is the 30s. Instead, a group of doctors went to Tuskegee University, a historically black college, and rounded up 400 men with syphilis and 200 without for a control group, and then they simply observed. A study that was supposed to last 6 months went on for 40 years. None of the men were told they had syphilis, leading to many other people being infected as a result. Next is Stonewall. The Stonewall riots were the turning point in American queer advocacy and the gay rights movement. It began as a spontaneous uprising after police raided the Stonewall Inn, a popular gay club. America in the 50s and 60s was actually worse to gay people than many Warsaw Pact countries, and after decades of prosecution and state-sanctioned violence, the gays had enough. The event is a complex and multifaceted one, but would become the face of gay advocacy for decades to come. Next is Claudette Colvin. Rosa Parks is well known for her refusal to leave her seat on the Montgomery bus, which led to the Montgomery bus boycott and played into the broader civil rights movement. What many people don't know, however, is that Rosa was not the first to refuse to give up her seat. Claudette Colvin was a schoolgirl, a teenager, when she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white couple. In segregated Montgomery, it was accepted that there were white seats and black seats on the bus, but if the white seats filled up, the black people would be forced to give up their remaining seats as well. Well, when Claudette and the pregnant woman she sat beside were ordered to vacate their seats, they refused, leading to her arrest. This likely inspired Rosa, which led to the broader bus boycott. Next is the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears is one of those events where it seems everyone's heard of it, but few really know what it is. America had been expanding ever westward, playing the classic colonial game of using tribes and nations against each other and always coming out on top. But now they didn't just want control, but the physical land the native bands had been allowed to maintain. The quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes, the Choctaw, Muskogee, Cherokee, Seminole, and Chickasaw nations, were all uprooted and forced to march to their new reservations. This was not a peaceful process, and extreme harm was dished out to ensure compliance. Then 60,000 people were forcibly displaced and forced to march anywhere from 1,700 to 5,000 miles by foot. Nearly 17,000 native people would perish on the journey or soon after arriving, and for the survivors, life was little better. Much of the land they were forced onto was barren and completely unfarmable, which is exactly why it was given to these native nations. Next is Tulsa. Tulsa, prior to June 1921, was known as Black Wall Street and was the wealthiest black neighborhood in America. At the time, segregation, while still awful and inhumane, at least allowed black businesses and homes to operate essentially on their own. Wealth could be generated and kept within the community, eventually building a strong black middle class. The massacre, however, began after a male black teen was accused of harming a white teen female. Fighting broke out that night as black men trying to prevent the teen from being lynched were accosted by a white mob. The riot broke out the next day and was supported by cops as well as literal 40 square blocks of Black Tulsa were fired, causing an equivalent of nearly 40 million modern dollars in damages. 10,000 black people were made homeless, and several hundred were likely ended. The Tulsa massacre wouldn't even be reported on and was kept silent for decades. Next are the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons nowadays may be known as funny talking detectives who stopped outlaws and renegades, but that really wasn't what they did. They're a private security firm, going where the money takes them and protecting whoever has the money, and the money often took them to strikes and labor organizers who were then brutally and viciously ended in a variety of horrific ways. Yes, the Pinkertons were mostly just a death squad for disgruntled workers. Forced to work overtime for no pay? Better not complain, or the Pinkertons might show up. Think that your job would be better if you and your buddies could collectively bargain for better rights? Better be prepared to have your entire family hunted down. And finally, the Philippines War. America didn't start invading nations on the other side of the world with Korea or Vietnam. Heck, even its invasion of the Philippines, part of the broader Spanish-American War, wasn't its first international invasion. But after defeating the Spanish, America wanted to become a real colonial power like all the big kids. For the Filipino, however, it meant they weren't so much liberated from the Spanish as under new management. Of course, propping up local resistance fighters to help you beat the colonial power kind of bites you in the butt when you decide to then replace that colonial power. Some 10,000 Filipino insurgents would lose their lives for 4,200 Americans, but the real toll was on the Filipino people, who were treated incredibly cruelly and brutally. There would be 250,000 civilian casualties. Those were 10 disturbing moments in American history schools refused to teach. I hope you found this valuable, and I'll see you next time.